Well, hello, Endow ladies. I'm here today with a man who doesn't really need an introduction. I'm here with the lovely George Weigel. Hi, George. How are you?
Simone, I'm great. Nice to be with you. Thank you.
It's so good to be with you, George. And just for some of you who may not know who he is, which is highly unfathomable to me, George is the papal biographer of John Paul II. He wrote Witness to Hope, The End and the Beginning, which is the sequel to Witness to Hope, and also his experiences with John Paul II's lessons in hope. So here I am. George, how many books have you written? I just have to, I've asked, I think I've asked you this before, but I want to know again.
I think we're up to 27 at this point. It's a lot of dead trees, I'm afraid, but I hope it's to good purpose.
Well, I think one of my favorite kind of facts about you is I think you have like 18 honorary doctorates or something crazy. You have the
19, but who's counting?
That's great. Well, Endow ladies, I'm just so happy to be here with George, and I had the privilege, my sister and I both had the privilege of studying under him in a program called the Tertio Millennio seminar, which takes place in Poland every summer. So if anybody doesn't know about it and knows some people, maybe your kids or grandkids who are interested in kind of these big ideas and having a dialogue about Catholic social teaching with Eastern Europeans. This is supposed to be the 30th year, correct, George?
It'll be the 30th year next year. Yeah, exactly.
Next year, yeah. So, well, I'm so happy to talk to you today, and I know this is a special week because of John Paul II's birthday. So I'm sure this has been a very intense week for you, regardless of our COVID isolation. So what have you been up to this week?
It has been a busy week. I've done a number of webinars, interviews. I've published a fair number of pieces. What I've tried to lift up in all of that is that you can't really understand John Paul II and his impact on both the church and the world unless you understand him as a radically converted Christian disciple. In 1996, he said to me, speaking of other biographical efforts, they try to understand me from the outside, but I can only be understood from inside. That's true of everybody to some degree, but it's particularly true of him because he was a man who lived from the inside out. Every great decision he made, every initiative he took was the fruit of his prayer. And he could be that shining light for others because he had spent his life trying to conform to the grace at work in him and conform his will to the divine will so that he could be a transmitter of grace to others. So I think that's important to keep in mind. He had an enormous impact on world history, but even that was the product of his discipleship. His role in the collapse of European communism was something he did as a pastor, not as a politician.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about him, not just because of his 100th birthday, but also that under all these kind of negative circumstances with COVID, that the meditation that keeps coming to my mind is that line, I think it's in Witness to Hope, about everything, or he perceived that everything, despite all the challenges politically and socially, but that everything was working for the good of his vocation. And I think for Christians, that could be, we could take that attitude here and now where things kind of seem bleak. So
you may be thinking of what he said in Fatima, or actually in Lisbon on his way to Fatima, on May 13th, 1982, a year to the day after the assassination attempt in Rome. He was on a pilgrimage to Fatima to give thanks for his life being spared a year before. And at the airport in Lisbon, he said, "In the designs of providence, there are no mere coincidences."
Yeah, that's right.
By which I think he meant that what we perceive as coincidence or happenstance or random is actually a facet of the divine plan for each one of us that we haven't quite gotten into the picture frame yet. And I think, in fact, the church has learned a lot during the past 2 months. There are an awful lot of very creative pastoral initiatives that have been undertaken over the past little while. Church has learned a lot more about communications technology and how it can be deployed for all sorts of ends, evangelical, catechetical, liturgical, whatever. We're being reminded that solidarity is not just a name for a movement or a trade union, it's a virtue. Solidarity is the virtue of living with others in such a way that all of our behaviors serve the common good. So we don't know what the long-term providential design of this moment is. I certainly hope it shakes all of us out of what I might call Eucharistic complacency. The hunger many people feel for the sacraments now is perhaps a hunger they haven't felt quite so intensely before, because the sacraments were so readily available. Yeah. So that's something that I hope comes out of this. The whole notion of spiritual communion has been revived in the church. Yeah. I said to my wife a couple of weeks ago, I don't think that prayer of St. Alphonsus Liguori, that prayer of spiritual communion, has been said so much in the last 100 years as in the last 2 months here. And that's a good thing to be reminded of as well. And another thing that I've been saying for months now, that we all need to remind ourselves, there is no such thing as a private mass. The priest celebrating by himself in a chapel is celebrating the Mass in union with the communion of saints. That's why he says the Confiteor exactly the same way as he would say it if there were 500 people there. So we all need to be reminded of that solidarity within the communion of saints, as well as the solidarity with our neighbors and friends.
Yeah, absolutely. That brings me to this subject of solidarity is something that is found within Catholic social teaching principles. And actually, it's wonderful to talk to you, not just because of John Paul II's birthday this week, but because our next study is going to be on Catholic social teaching. And so can you encourage women to, want to study this? And what is Catholic, for somebody who maybe has heard about it or has different impressions about Catholic social teaching or kind of prejudices or biases, how is a Catholic woman of today supposed to approach and look at Catholic social teaching? And it's a really big question, but.
Catholic social teaching or Catholic social doctrine is a distinctive body of thought that in its papal form begins with Pope Leo XIII in 1891 with the encyclical Rerum Novarum, and in its classical form really continues through John Paul II's encyclical on the centenary of Rerum Novarum, Centesimus Annus, the 100th year. This is a very distinctively Catholic way of thinking about society, culture, politics, and economics. It ultimately grows out of the Bible, but it more specifically in its modern form grows out of Pope Leo's deep reflection on St. Thomas Aquinas and his thinking about politics, society, culture, and economics as a distinctively Catholic way of dealing with all of the challenges of the modern world. And that way of thinking has shown itself very flexible and relevant as the modern world gave way to the late modern world and has now given way to the postmodern world. I think perhaps the most important idea in the social doctrine of the church right now is that politics and economics are always downstream from culture. If there's something wrong with the politics and economics, It's almost certainly because there's something wrong with the public moral culture, with people's sense of what's good, what's life-giving, what's valuable. And that's a very important lesson for us to learn at a time of real political dysfunction in the United States. I think that dysfunction ultimately has to do with dramatically different views of the human person, human origins, human community, human destiny. It has to do with two different cultures. I mean, a culture formed by a biblical view of the human person, and a culture formed by a kind of dumbed down, romanticized, sentimentalized view of the human person, in which, you know, I did it my way becomes the national anthem, which is not really a good idea.
Terrible song, terrible.
It's really not a good idea. And I think we've seen in this pandemic a kind of existential or living refutation of that. I mean, my experience of people in my neighborhood has been there's a lot more cooperation, there's a lot more helping each other out, there's a lot more, is there anything I can do for you? Even as we're all more or less stuck at home and working at home.
But this desire, the desire to be in communion.
Yeah. I mean, we've even had, you know, cul-de-sac cocktail hours outside my window here.
That's some COVID creativity. I do like it.
And, you know, that helps. But no, you know, perhaps you could share with folks that, with your ladies, that essay that on an overview of Catholic social doctrine that's in the reader you had last summer, because that kind of touches the basic principles, what John Paul II added to this, some issues for the future.
Well, yeah, and I'm so excited about this study, not just because of my particular love for Catholic social teaching and being educated and informed by you, George, but also because there's so much ideologies in the church, so much politicization, there's just a lot of that, and a lot of those conversations are fruitful, some not. I'm going to ask you about how to filter out some of them, but the starting point is the same starting point as what you said about John Paul II, which is that if we really want to be fruitful in the public square, we have to be people that have prayer lives and have a good anthropology and understanding, because these seem like weak things: a strong prayer life, being a disciple of Jesus Christ, right? Understanding, having a proper anthropology of man, but actually these are the crucial things that affect everything else. And so I'm really excited to get this in the hands of women in the church. For that reason.
You know, at some point we're going to have to come up with a better word than anthropology, which I think, you know, rings up for most people studying Stone Age people.
Yes.
And what we're really talking about here, and this goes back to Leo XIII, is that your view of what a human being is and where we came from and what our destiny is, and how our communities are formed, beginning with the community of marriage and the family. This has an enormous amount to do with how you think about everything else. It's really determinative of how you think about society, culture, economics, politics, whatever. And if, as so many, unfortunately, of our fellow Americans think today, the human person is infinitely plastic and malleable. Whatever I say I am is what I really am. The satisfaction, the immediate satisfaction of my desires, whatever they may be, whether they're noble or base, or whatever, is the meaning of life, and that the state, the government, has an obligation to help me satisfy those desires, whatever they are. That's what some people misunderstand by human rights. This is all a prescription for very, very serious trouble.
Yeah.
And I mean, the most extreme form of that right now is in the transgender movement, which is an absolute triumph of bad ideas over empirical reality.
Yeah.
Bad ideas over scientific reality. And we got a big challenge on our hands, in which, frankly, women are going to have to take the lead in meeting these challenges, because if they're not met, then the social doctrine of the church suggests that the moral and cultural foundations of American democracy are going to crumble. And when the foundations crumble, the structure crumbles as well.
Yeah, am I wrong in thinking it's going to crumble, but that we can delay its crumble and then we have to rebuild after the crumble? Maybe that's my apocalyptic self.
That's certainly one scenario. I mean, my dear friend, Cardinal Francis George, famously said that he would die in his bed, his successor would die in prison, his successor would be executed in the public square, and his successor, this is the part that nobody ever quotes, so it was a fourth part to this.
Oh, I didn't know that.
The next successor would, like the church has done so many times before over 2,000 years, help society pick up the fragments of a broken culture and start all over again.
Yes.
That's one option. That's one possibility. It is very difficult to imagine our society living indefinitely with such drastically different views of what a human being is,
right,
as prevail today. There's a reason why, for example, the abortion license continues to be the single most fevered and divisive issue in our politics.
Yeah.
It touching on everything from education to now, how do we deal with the sexual abuse of women? There is one reason why the reaction to Dr. Blasey Ford's accusations against now Justice Kavanaugh were treated one way, and Ms. Reed's accusations against Vice President Biden have been treated another way. And that reason is Kavanaugh was thought to be a threat to the abortion license, and Biden is rightly thought to be a friend of it.
Right.
So everything gets distorted when you get something really wrong.
Right.
And it's really wrong to think that the product of human conception is anything other than a human being. That's a scientific reality.
Right.
And it's really wrong to think that people we find inconvenient at whatever stage of life they're in, including life before they're born, are people that we can dispose of if that makes our lives, if we think that makes our lives happier or easier or whatever. So ideas really do have consequences. And that's why it's so important for you and Endow and the people involved in Endow to take these ideas of Catholic social doctrine, which includes, Catholic social doctrine includes the defense of human life from conception till natural death, so seriously. So I'm delighted you're doing that.
Yeah, we're happy about that. And I think you touched on so many points. Which one do I go with? I think, you know, as for someone like me who studied theology and who has a great love for the faith, the ideas, I see how the ideas are really crucial and important. I think a lot of Endow women do as well. They understand that ideas have consequences and bad ideas have bad consequences, and seek to learn and to educate themselves, because if women are, as maybe Edith Stein would say, the crafter of souls, like we've got to craft them in a particular way. But then also that element of hospitality that I think the feminine genius can bring, where we're not just saying, oh, here's a scientific fact, which is true, but that we're creating places of belonging for people, right? And reaching people in different peripheries and whatnot to make the ideas actually feasible and a reality, to make the ideal real. So I'd love to ask you, what what have you seen out there? And one of the things that was hard for me at first when, thinking about the feminine genius, or that whole being a whole concept for me, was that, well, I come from a whole family of really strong women, so we don't need to be told that we're powerful women. but also that I don't think it seems strange to me at first that a woman doesn't need to be, I think of Mary, right? That there was no way that Mary was tooting her own horn saying like, I'm the model, she was just like in her feminine way, doing all the things and being all the things that she was, that changed the course of history. But as I working for Endow, becoming a little bit more open to that, emotionally speaking, right? That this is a real thing that we ought to talk about, right? What have you seen are expressions of the feminine genius out there that you think, okay, that's femininity done right. That's a game-changing situation. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, let's begin with Our Lady. John Paul II gave a remarkable Christmas address to the Roman Curia in December 1987. When he said, the church is constantly being reformed and renewed in the image of the great figures of the New Testament. Right. So the church of evangelization and proclamation is constantly being formed and renewed in the image of St. Paul. The church of contemplative prayer, the interior church, if you will, is constantly being formed and reformed in the image of John the Beloved. Mm-hmm. The church of authority and jurisdiction is being formed and reformed in the image of St. Peter. Then he dropped the little bombshell and said, and all of that has to do fundamentally with the church that is being formed and renewed in the image of Mary, who is the paradigm of Christian discipleship, and whose articulated fiat in the Annunciation, be it done unto me according to your word, mm-hmm. as well as what I've come to call the silent fiat at the foot of the cross, mm-hmm. captured beautifully in Michelangelo's Pietà. That's the pattern of all Christian discipleship. Mary is the beginning of the church. And everything else in the church, he then, gave the screw another twist here. Everything else in the church, whether it's Peter or John or Paul, or, by the way, you curial people, all the stuff that you guys do, depends on this Marian profile. That is very, very important to recognize. The church begins with a lay woman without office. And that's the fundamental pattern of the church.
Yeah.
Forever. And you see that all over the place today. I mean, you see it in so many outstanding wives and mothers. You see it in religious women. The extraordinary witness that the Sisters of Life, for example, give in embodying the fact, to go back to where we were a minute ago on the abortion issue, that truth and mercy always go together, that we cannot proclaim the inalienable dignity and value of the unborn child unless we do the same for the woman in crisis pregnancy, yeah. and help take care of her. As Simone, there are thousands of crisis pregnancy centers in the United States. They are the pastoral embodiment of the truth of the right to life cause. We don't just talk the talk, we walk the walk here.
Right.
And we offer women in crisis something better than a technological fix that is going to leave them with a burden of guilt that many experience for the rest of their lives. So that witness, what we saw in that film Unplanned, which was really, really quite something. that's all part of making this feminine genius, if you will,
Yeah.
come alive.
Yeah. Yeah.
The notion that being being powerful in the church means sitting at a desk, diocesan chancery or parish office or the Roman curia,
Yeah.
is really quite bizarre.
Yes.
The power of discipleship is in bringing others to Christ. And it's a lot more satisfying to bring others to meet the Lord than to be able to tell other people, you do this and you don't do that. I mean,
Right.
it's debasing everybody to think that power means power in the Nietzschean sense. I get to impose
Right.
my power on,
Right. That's
on
right.
you. Now, having said that, it is also true that going forward in the church, there has to be a much broader consultation of those who have pastoral authority within the church with lay people, and especially with women. A lot of the problems, to put it gently, crimes, sins,
Right.
grave sins, of which we become aware over the last 20 years, might have been forestalled or prevented if there had been, for example, closer involvement of mature Orthodox Catholic women in seminary formation.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
women see things about men that men don't see about themselves. I've been learning this the hard way for 44 years.
Glad you said it first.
But this is, and look, some of the best seminaries in the country have figured this out, and are making it part of their formation, particularly their human formation program. So none of that theology of the Marian profile is intended to suggest that we've got the balance right on who gets consulted about what. We need to work on that a lot more. But it is to suggest that if you confuse the power of Christian discipleship with flying a desk in a church office, you need to think about that a little bit.
Right. Exactly. And thank you for all that. It really corresponds to kind of my thoughts and meditations, especially during this like heightened time where I feel like I'm working more than I ever have, but have more time for reflection. But sorry, George, what were you going to say?
No, I was just going to say, and there is certainly a place for competent Catholic women in church offices. I mean, one of your fellow alums of the Tertio Millennium Seminar is the chief operating officer of one of the largest dioceses in the country. She's an absolutely brilliant management person, and she's 100% Orthodox Catholic. So, that's fine. That's her call.
That's her call, right.
That's her vocation. Right. And I urged her to take this on when she began doing it 10 to 12 years ago, knowing how difficult it was going to be for her. But the bigger point is that we live discipleship. Most of us are going to live it at a retail level.
Yes.
Family, neighborhood, local community, and whatnot. And that's fine, because we're going to have to rebuild this culture at the retail level. And the church has an essential role to play in that.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head, and I love that, because we're right now, Endow's going through the Edith Stein study, which I had chose before COVID hit, and it turned out to be like kind of perfect, especially with JP2's birthday. But she kind of takes it for granted that women can hold any job that they want, and for her, it's like you said, this is not even the point. It's not even the issue. The more interesting thing is what you were saying, which is that the feminine has this capacity to to be a crafter of souls and to be a mentor to rebuilding to souls as we rebuild culture in these small but not so small ways that are essential to the social fabric and the freedom of our society. And I think that's where women really need the masculine genius. So you're it right now, George, right? To say yes, like we listen, we trust, and we can let you do what you do, which is pay attention to those things that get missed. And that's not a small thing. And I think sometimes even wonderful Orthodox Catholic women, etc., think that their contribution is too small. And I'm thinking, no, in fact, you said retail, I love that. It is an essential part of the social fabric that needs to be cared for and needs to be that we need to be excited about, right? That there's an exceptionality to the ordinary.
I hope that in your study of St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, Edith Stein, that you read John Paul II's homily at her canonization. I happened to be there for that. It was an extraordinary experience. I think it was one of the great homilies of the pontificate. It was obviously a challenging circumstance for many reasons. But it was also, that homily was an expression of his great regard for her, as what he once said to me over the dinner table, as a paradigmatic figure. He said she was a paradigmatic figure of the 20th century, the skeptic who comes to faith, the skeptic who comes to a grasp of the truth philosophically, the woman trying to find her way in a male-dominated academic world, the daughter of, in the case of her mother, a very pious Jewish lady,
right,
who finds the fulfillment of her Judaism and Christianity, and then ultimately her self-sacrifice. Let us go for our people. Extraordinary figure. But the most important thing to learn from her, I think, and this goes back to where we began with John Paul II, was the intensity of her prayer. She did a lot of her writing under obedience. You know, she wrote that memoir of growing up in a Jewish family, what was in Breslau, under obedience. She wrote a lot of her philosophical work because her superiors told her to.
I didn't know that yet.
She would say on Sundays, thank God it's Sunday, all I have to do is pray. I mean, the fact that she had a day in which she could do nothing but pray was, to her mind, the best possible kind of a day.
I love that.
That's a very powerful witness from a real genius, and a genius in the human sense as well as the intellectual sense, I think.
Yeah, that's incredible, especially because maybe hope I don't get in trouble with all my awesome Catholic gal pals who write lots of books, but it seems like a lot of the saints were, like you were saying, were compelled to write by their superiors, and now it seems like we're flooded with all this Catholic stuff out there that a lot of it's fruitful and good, but then we're just being saturated when really we just need to get down on our knees and pray. No.
Well, the prayer is essential for sifting out the wheat from the chaff in all of this. I mean, I've been saying ever since the internet changed everybody's lives 25 years ago, the internet reminds us why God invented editors.
Yes.
If there aren't some gatekeepers, if there aren't some sheriffs, it's really going to be the Wild West. And that's exactly what it is.
The new Wild West.
The new Wild West. And it's the new Wild West, like the old Wild West, can get pretty ugly sometimes. I mean, I personally will have nothing to do with either Twitter or Facebook.
Yeah.
Twitter in particular, I think, is a genuinely demonic force.
I,
It
I refuse to get,
it
yeah.
dumbs down thought. And people say, well, it's a way to watch people work out their ideas in real time. Well, some things should not be watched. Making sausage, making laws, and working out your thoughts. I mean, this doesn't have to be
externally
public.
processing with a friend is not the same thing as externally processing with the internet.
This is really not a good idea.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people find Facebook a useful catechetical tool, and I'm glad
Yeah.
they do.
Yeah.
It's not my world. I prefer something a little more measured. And I do think it helps to think things through for a while before inflicting them on the general public.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure quite how we got onto
Well,
this.
I mean,
It causes me to imagine Edith Stein tweeting.
right. And again, like, if you're on Twitter, whatever, that's fine. But the point being, and I mean, I notice this too, George, is that the women that I look up to as my role models, the ones that are my touchstones, they don't have time for social media. They don't have time for Facebook, right? They're too busy living the good life and contributing in the unique way that God has called them to. So I think, and again, I'm not an anti-technology or social media person. I'm on social media, and I think it can be very helpful and fruitful. But if it's a distraction away from your personal vocation, your call, then you got to get rid of it. And I remember I gave a talk once at the Carmelite Retreat House, and this little teeny boppy girl had come to it, which she's not our demographic, but there she was. And she said, I really appreciate your talk. And I thought, oh, I'm going to reach out to her on Instagram, and I'm up with the youth. And, and I said, what's your Instagram handle? I'll message you, and, thinking I was so holy to put myself out there for her. And she's like, oh no, I don't do social media. I just like to read books. And I thought, this is giving me hope for the future, for the youth, because that's what I want. I at some point, we want to witness to each other enough on social media that we can get off of it or stay on it to reach the peripheries and to reach the Edith Steins out there during her atheistic phase that hasn't been evangelized yet. I think I think Bishop Barron talks about that, where, the digital age, right? That being in the peripheries digitally, we could be on there in a more fruitful way instead of just kind of arguing amongst ourselves or just navel gazing and looking at what other Catholics are doing. And am I doing enough as I mean, the comparisons, especially for women, I think are really need to stop.
Yeah, well, I'm sure there's some community building that can go on through social media.
Absolutely.
I'm going to leave that to others, including my friend Bishop Barron, and I will get on with being one of the finest minds of the 9th century here, and think that Gutenberg had a good idea, and print is important. I really think we're going to discover, this is apropos of nothing, but I think there's a fair amount of empirical data that now indicates that people retain stuff better when they read it in a book rather than on a screen.
Yep.
And I think that it's not an accident that printing and paper were invented. I think there's something hardwired into us that connects the tactile and the intellectual in a way. And, books are old friends. I mean, you ought to take your books off the shelf at least once a year and say hi to them. And my rule is if I haven't touched it for 10 years, I'm unlikely to touch it in the future. So it's going to be given away. But they get 10 years of grace.
What are some of your go-to books that they're your prized possessions? Because I made the mistake when I moved out of Virginia. I got rid of my Balthazar collection. I donated it to Christendom College, and now I have all sorts of regrets. So I don't know if I can ever give a book.
I have a number of books that John Paul II signed for me. So those are
your specials.
Kind of special. I go back and read a lot of Evil and Law every 4 years.
Bride says one of my favorite books.
I have tomorrow morning on the treadmill, I will finish my fifth or sixth watching of the 1981 Brideshead
So good.
television series, which I think is the greatest adaptation of a novel ever on film.
I agree. It's so
And they got it right because they just basically used the book as the script and didn't try to rewrite the thing. So I go back to those sorts of things a fair amount.
I love that you're a Waugh fan. That makes me happy. That makes me really happy.
One of the best essays I ever wrote was on Evil and Waugh. It's still available at the First Things website.
I'm gonna go
Google George Weigel, Evil and Waugh, First Things.
I'm definitely gonna go find that.
That essay grew out of a foreword I wrote for the reprint edition of probably Waugh's least known novel, but which I think is really great for spiritual reading. It's called Helena. It's about the mother of Constantine. It was an experimental novel. I mean, he wrote it in a very curiously telegraphic form. He has Helena talking like a 1920s flapper in Great Britain. He's the young Helena. But it's a very, very powerful reflection on vocation. One thing, as Brideshead is a brilliant evocation of what St. Augustine meant by the ladder of love, climbing from lesser loves to higher loves. Helena is really a book about vocation.
Oh, I love it.
Learning what's the one thing that God intended for your life, and then going ahead and doing it.
I love that.
It's quite striking. It's also hilariously funny, as only Waugh could be.
Oh, that's great.
But that's my kind of bad, cold, lie in bed reading, if you will.
That's great. That tells you where your true heart is. If you're sick, and what book you choose when you're sick in bed that's where your treasure is. I love that. That's beautiful. I love Waugh. And my sister actually is a huge Waugh fan as well. And I love that you brought up, because I wanted to talk to you about this too. And I know we're running out of time, so I'll keep it brief. But that we're doing so back last summer when Father Mache and you were encouraging us to do some sort of gesture for John Paul II in solidarity with the Darna Project. Well, what Endow is going to do is to have a conference on the Holy Spirit. And we have a Sister of Life that's going to speak to us, who has a nice, beautiful, long history with Endow, and also a priest who's kind of a Carmelite charismatic type priest. And my hope, George, is that this would be kind of a mini June 2nd, 1979 moment for Endow women who are coming, that whatever that you, like you said, that unique thing that God is calling you to do, that it would be a spark to just kind of tip some women over the edge and just do it. So I would love your encouragement for that.
No, that's great. And talking about tipping points and whatnot.
Yeah.
And the centenary, that film that you watched and we discussed last summer, Liberating a Continent, that is available on one of the streaming services. I can't remember whether it's YouTube or Amazon Prime or Netflix or whatever. But of course, the June 2nd homily, the Pentecost homily of John Paul II on his first papal pilgrimage to Poland is that's the fulcrum of that whole story. And that would be something that your Endow women could watch with their families. I mean, it's a very, very well done film.
It's wonderful. I linked it to our newsletter with the conference, but I'll link it again also to this conversation we're having. But I agree with you, and I'm just so excited to see and probe and pray that this conference, because it's our dar nod to John Paul II, and because it's on the Vigil of Pentecost, so it'll be in the Vigil of Pentecost here in less than 2 weeks, that it will be the tipping point for many women. And I think, So
the conference you're going to do online, presumably, right?
it is online, yeah.
Did that change? The original plan was to get, I bet you'll get more people online that you might have gotten in person.
It's God works in mysterious ways. And one of the things that I really enjoyed learning from you in Poland was, and it really spoke to my heart, because actually I've always had a devotion to the Holy Spirit, even before kind of God the Father and Jesus. And is that John Paul II was always asking questions because he knew the Holy Spirit was always up to something. And I think the Holy Spirit is up to something with Endow Women. It seems like there is kind of like a shift coming, and I hope and pray, it's up to the Holy Spirit, but like I hope and pray that this conference will be that little shift. So
I hope it is too, and I'll certainly keep you in my prayers.
thank you. And so a last question before I just ask you anything else that you want to share with us is, and this is from someone from our Endow team, what's the most important thing we can keep at the forefront of our minds as women that's part of John Paul II's legacy? So hard question, but
yeah, I think you're undoubtedly studying Mulieris Dignitatem and things like that, theology of the body. What I've been saying to people throughout this centenary period is enough nostalgia is enough. We got to stop looking backwards at him and start looking forwards through his eyes.
Yeah.
And that means absorbing his magisterium, pondering his example, but then looking forward through his eyes. And for Catholic women, that means, I think, essentially to become active agents of the new evangelization. Everyone in the church is a missionary disciple. Everywhere is mission territory. Mission territory isn't just weird places in National Geographic or whatever.
Right. Sometimes
every place is mission territory. Right. And there are a number of those places where women are especially equipped or fit to make the offer of friendship with Jesus Christ. Yeah. And if it is at all possible to turn what is wrong in postmodern feminism into what is right, it will be through discipleship. Mm-hmm. So the conversion of the feminist movement to a movement formed in the image of she who is the beginning of the church, as we were saying a few moments ago. That's a great task for the future.
Thank you, George. And I just wanted to mention, because I had this next to me right now, so I didn't plan it, but I've been really enjoying reading this. So for all the women watching, and this is great, especially because I just love understanding kind of the intellectual gaps or the ideas that have shaped the larger culture where the church has responded and how she's responded. So I shout out to that book. I'll also link it. Anything else you want to tell us before we say goodbye?
No, good luck with the Pentecost conference. Let's pray for a new outpouring of the Holy Spirit.
Thank you.
Everybody stay safe and well. And it's great to see you, Simone, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, George.